In this video, I'll be changing a rear caliper on the Mondeo. Not a difficult job overall, but working with brake lines and caliper pistons and the like can seem a bit intimidating if you haven't done it before. On that note, I should say up front, if you're not confident working on brakes, then don't. I mean, maybe don't make this your first car project ever, because obviously the consequences of messing up brakes can be dire. So proceed at your own risk. You'll need the car up on axle stands and the wheels off, obviously. The Mondeo rear calipers have a bad habit of seizing up, and usually it's the integrated handbrake part of them that does it. These cars don't have independent drums for the parking brake. So as you can see here, when the handbrake cable is activated, the lever's just not moving, seized solid. This is the other side. This is what it should look like. So before you rush into buying a new caliper though, if this is the problem that you have, you should make sure that the handbrake cable isn't what's seized. So the first job you should do is unhook the cable here from the inside of the caliper with a pair of pliers. And in doing this, you'll be able to see if the cable moves freely in its sleeve or if it's seized up. Then obviously you need to unhook this cable to replace the caliper anyway. So there's how you do it. Anyway, the caliper might have failed other ways. Maybe the piston is just stuffed. So I'll assume now that the caliper wants replacing for whatever reason. Here's my new one. This is a rebuilt unit, which I recommend in general. There's a little point in buying a brand new Bosch unit, as they'd be way expensive. And lots of brake shops and places will sell you rebuilt units based on older casings, but with all of the relevant bits properly serviced and replaced if necessary. And they usually resurface and paint them up so that they look practically new, like this one. In this case, silver, of course, but I've already painted all my calipers black. So while this is still off the car, I took the opportunity to spray it to match. Not sure I'd go with black again, to be honest, but it's easier to do one caliper off the car than it is 3 on the car. So anyway, when you've got the caliper, make 100% sure that it is the correct type. On the Mk3 Mondeo, for example, they changed the design of the rear calipers after a few years, around 2004, and this is the older type. You need to make sure it's correct, and obviously the right side. So just check at least visually that it compares to the existing one. Then we can set about removing the old unit, and we'll just crack loose the fittings first. We'll do the brake line first. You want a flare nut spanner for that, a 14mm in this case. So if you're not familiar with the difference, this is what it looks like, the flare nut spanner. Notice how unlike a normal open spanner with flats, it has an almost complete hex, just with the opening to fit over the line, and it's much thicker for added stiffness. So this is much less likely to strip the small pipe fittings that don't have a lot of mechanical strength to them. So we just want to crack this fitting loose while the caliper is still mounted to the carrier, otherwise it would be difficult to do. Don't try to actually undo it now, or it's just going to start leaking brake fluid. Next we'll do the retaining bolts, just a conventional hex socket. This is a 13. And you'll probably want a breaker bar on it to make life easy. Just crack that loose, but again, don't take it out just yet. And then same on the bottom one. Right, looking at the new caliper before it goes on, there's just 1 or 2 preparatory things I'd suggest doing at this stage. Firstly, this damn handbrake lever that seizes up, its internal mechanism is protected by this seal that you can see down there between the lever and the caliper body. But given how they tend to seize, it's possible that those seals are what's failing, or at least letting in brake dust and other crap. So over time it accumulates internally. So it might be a good idea to add some grease around the outside of the seal, just as a bit of extra protection. So what I'm doing here is just putting a small amount of thick silicone grease around the perimeter. I'm not sure how much it'll do, but if it slows down penetration of junk into the inside at all, then I figure it's worthwhile. The other thing you usually want to do is put some anti-seize copper or nickel-based grease between the backs of the brake pads and the contact surfaces on the caliper. This is to allow the calipers to move around and find their position without sticking or jamming or generating vibration and noise that will manifest probably as brake squeaking. Normally you see this being applied directly to the backs of the pads, but in this case I'm not taking the pads out, and anyway doing it this way means that I don't apply excess grease to areas that aren't actually in contact. So just smear the surfaces with grease as shown. Then when ready we can take the bolts out completely, and now the caliper will be disconnected, mechanically speaking, from the carrier. By the way, remember that you need the handbrake cable disconnected. I showed you that before, so do it now if you didn't already. And then it's time now, by the way, for the rubber gloves to protect your skin from brake fluid, which is nasty stuff. Speaking of which, it's often recommended that you clamp the brake line to prevent leaks. But I don't like the idea of squeezing tight and flat an old line all that much for fear of damaging the rubber. So the alternative is just have the new caliper ready to go, and we'll just work quickly, and so avoid losing too much fluid or getting too much air up into the system. So get the new caliper ready to hand, and then the last thing to do in removing the old one is to undo the brake line. Now obviously you can't undo the line itself so long as it's still attached to the car, so you need to undo the thread by turning the caliper itself. So you just turn it and turn it and turn it until it eventually comes apart, and immediately put your finger over the brake line end to cover it, and at the same time grab the new caliper and start to turn it back onto the line. Try to engage the thread as quickly as possible because the line will be leaking fluid slowly while you do this, but make sure you don't cross thread it, of course, and then it's just a tedious case of turning the new caliper round and round again until you have it up finger tight, at least against the line fitting. You should make sure that you keep the weight of the caliper supported all this time, by the way. Don't ever let it hang off the line, or you might damage the hose or its upper fitting. At this point, use the flare nut spanner again and tighten the line fitting against the caliper. It doesn't need a lot of torque, just nice and tight by hand with the length of this spanner is enough. And the next thing, you must align the caliper piston. Now you can get special tools to wind in a caliper piston if you're replacing brake pads, or you can use an Allen key in the case of this version of the caliper. But for this rebuilt unit, it's already retracted, so all I need to do is align it correctly, and it's possible to turn it just with long nose pliers placed with pressure against the piston as shown. So on these there is a nib at the top of the piston housing, and on the left hand caliper shown here, the concave semicircular cutout on the piston must be turned to be adjacent that nib, but on the right hand side it should be opposite it, i.e. 180 degrees different. So this applies to the older version. On the post 2004 cars you have to center it, but the exact orientation doesn't matter. Now I'll put some notes below the video on this along with info on retracting it on different car models, which way to wind, etc., because it's a bit complicated. You'll notice also I've done this after the brake line's been attached already, so there's some brake fluid internally now. And also, if you have to retract your piston a lot, you should back off the bleed valve first in order to prevent pushing the old fluid back up into the system when you retract the piston. Then you need to place the caliper back on its carrier and just check to see if it's in the best orientation to remove twist from the brake line. Now you can see here that there's some twist that's been introduced into it, and it only gets worse if I rotate the caliper one way or the other, so it's only about 90 degrees worth. So you might get lucky and not need to do this, but in my case there's more twists left there than I'm happy with. I'd rather things be nice and relaxed. So I'm going to have to take the twist out. The way you do that is just undo the brake line at its other end, i.e. at the car side. Now to do that, you first need to take out this retaining clip at its bracket, which I found a total nightmare as it was really well stuck in there, probably with the help of a bit of corrosion. Pliers were just a bad joke, they weren't going to work. So you can lever it out a little, but only so far. And these small vice grips weren't up to the task either. So I soaked it in penetrating oil and I left it for a little while, And then it did finally come out with the use of larger vice grips. It wants a good clean while you're here, I would say. Then you need to undo the fitting. For that you'll need another flare nut spanner and an open-ended flat spanner. 11mm flare nut, 17mm flat. 17 in like that. And you might want to put a rag underneath because you'll be getting a small brake fluid leak again. And then holding the flat spanner still, turn the flare nut against it and get it loose. You can see brake fluid starting to drip again. That's okay, just ignore that. And once you've undone the flare nut at the front side enough, you'll be able to pull the whole line backward a little bit. And you'll see that the line fitting is keyed into the bracket. So once it's out of the keyed socket, you can turn it a little bit, and that's what will allow you to take the twist out of the line, like I'm doing here. Now, once you're happy with the line, push it back into the bracket, and you get the flat spanner back onto the flats, and use the flare nut spanner to tighten up the flare nut again, like so. Now give it a clean up, as there will be brake fluid all over it. And finally, the retaining clip needs to go back in. It requires a lot of force, this bloody thing. As you can see, it really fights. The secret, as with many things, is a pair of big vice grips. Alright, back to the caliper. The retaining bolts can go back in now. I suggest that you clean them up. A scrub with a wire brush is good, and blast them off with brake clean. And I really recommend that you put some medium strength thread locker, this is blue Loctite, on these, just for the sake of safety. You don't want these backing out when you're driving. And when you tighten them, you really do need a torque wrench. You don't want to guess things too much when it comes to brakes. The closer you follow the engineering specs, the better. So these are spec'd by Ford at 30 Newton meters. If it's worth doing right. By the way, the larger head on the torque wrench made things awkward here for me, so I used this long extension bar to get clear of everything that was interfering, as you can see. Good, so that's the fittings done. Now get the handbrake cable attached again. Just the reversal of removal, hook it back on, although you may need to action the handbrake lever using a pair of vice grips in order to find enough slack in the cable. And then that's the caliper basically installed. But we must next flush and bleed the brake fluid. This step is critical. Go take off the brake fluid cap in the engine bay. The level may have dropped a little if you lost a lot of fluid. And then loosen the bleed valve on the caliper. It's an 11mm flare nut again. And take off the rubber cap if you haven't already. Now I have a video about bleeding your brakes, and I'm not going to repeat everything here. So if you don't know how to do it, I suggest watching that to learn first. And you might want to replace the fluid and bleed all 4 brakes while you're doing the one, because you'll already be a quarter of the way into the job, if you see what I mean, so why not? Now you can use an assistant, but here I'm using a bleed kit I made myself, where I attached this hose and a bottle to the bleed nipple, with the hose going into some old fluid in the bottom of the bottle, and placed above the caliper. Also the air once out cannot ever go back down. You start pumping the brakes and you'll get fluid and air out of the valve and start filling up the bottle. You want to do a good bleed here, 10 to 20 pumps on the brakes, on the brake at least, or half a litre or so of fluid through it. I would say it would be about right. And then go close off the bleed valve and carefully remove the hose as shown so you don't spill the fluid. And then don't forget, of course, to go top up the brake fluid with new fluid from a newly opened bottle, and you should be good. Now that you've got hydraulic pressure, go pump the brake pedal some more, and after a few presses the piston will get pushed out to the right position against the pad. It needs to end up like this, depending on how much wear is in the pads. And you want to do this before you drive down a steep hill, as the brake pedal will just go through the floor the first time you use it until this piston has sorted itself out. And you should probably test the handbrake lever as well to make sure that that's working properly. And then put the cap back on the bleed valve. And finally, now that you've applied some pressure to the hydraulics, just have a check around all the fittings to make sure that none are leaking brake fluid. In my case, that means both ends of the flexible brake line, top and bottom, and the bleed valve. Then that's really it. Put the wheel back on, and as a final test, you can spin the thing and go stamp on the brake, and guess what should happen? Right, I hope that was helpful. Have fun.